I raised that on the strength of a large logo co-development partner who then the relationship literally dissolved 30 days after we had closed that $500,000. So I had $500,000 of investors that had invested on the strength of this logo co-development, and it literally fell apart 30 days later.
Welcome to the Product Market Fit Show, brought to you by Mistral, a seed stage firm based in Canada. I'm Pablo. I'm a founder turned VC. My goal is to help early stage founders like you find product market fit. So today we have Adrian, the founder and CEO of Athennian. Athennian provides a data management platform for legal and finance teams. They're based in Calgary. They've raised about $50 million and have over 100 employees. Adrian, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks. Good to be here, Pablo.
So the topic of today's episode is how to do customer discovery, specifically when selling B2B SaaS to mid-market customers. I think there's, in the world of B2B SaaS startups, a kind of sweet spot space, right? Like people oftentimes don't like selling enterprise because it's too slow, it's too chunky. And SMBs oftentimes don't really have the sort of, structure and size and capital to be meaningful customers. So this mid-market tends to be a sweet spot for many. So I'm excited to dive into that with you. Maybe as a starting point, we can kind of go back a little bit and just talk about how you came up with the idea itself.
So we're going back to like 2016. I was a lawyer at a large corporate law firm in Calgary. I'm originally from the Toronto area, so I moved to Calgary for that. What surprised and shocked me when I started working as a lawyer was just how hard it was for companies to provide basic information about their entities when we were trying to do a transaction. So any business of any like material size, once you kind of get past SMB, a company is more than one entity. That's typically, a handful or more corporations, limited partnerships, all stitched together into some type of corporate structure. And so, we were up all night trying to figure out like what the formal legal name of certain entities are. Companies just don't have that data internally. It got recorded on a spreadsheet one day, and it's being colloquialized and abbreviated so many times. And when you're trying to transact and do formal transactions, it's important that you get the accurate legal data point. And so even basic things like just what the entity's name is really hard for organizations to manage. When you get into more complex stuff like the ownership details, the control details, the tax details, presence, international presence details, it just goes downhill from there. And so I really wanted to understand why this problem was so bad, why it was so hard for tax, finance, and legal professionals who are all very smart and have lots of resources to keep all this organized. And we really just discovered, it was really just a data management issue. So the systems to manage all this information were binders on shelves, and then just tons of old legacy software, spreadsheets. It was just a lot of like pre-internet type of stuff. And the problem is everybody needs this information. And so it just gets highly fragmented and you just standard kind of, business workflow, business data management type of problem. And so in about 2017, we started building into this space and fast forward, here we are.
And just to be clear, like who mainly experiences the problem? Is it the legal firm like a Gowlings or something like that? Or is it the actual client, the corporation?
Yeah, so it's everybody. So everybody experiences it in like a little bit of a different way. The way to think about it that is maybe more a little bit sort of accessible is like if your bookkeeping or accounting records were just a mess, right? And the data wasn't accurate and you have a spreadsheet with numbers in it, but you have no receipts or contracts to like evidence any of that. That's a problem internally for the company. In various departments, it's a problem for the accountant, it's a problem for tax advisors, it's a problem for the CRA or the IRS, who's ever your tax authority. That's a really good analogy to the type of problem that we have here. And to kind of sort of paint a picture, when the sort of the like aha moment for me, we had to do due diligence on a company that's now actually a customer of Athennian when I was back at the law firm. On their legal structure, we went into a boardroom and there were 500 binders in bankers' boxes on this boardroom. And we had to flip through every single page of these 500 binders to find signature, like documents that weren't signed by the board of directors, confirming that shareholders had approved all the financial statements every year. And each binder was an entity in this company's corporate structure. And so it's constant rediscovery and revalidation of data that already exists, just so you can take it, execute a transaction or make some decision. And so that's felt by internal legal tax finance teams. It's felt by law firms, accounting firms, audit and tax advisory. Anybody who's been in like M&A, banking, typically experiences this problem.
So that's helpful in terms of the problem. So I guess my big question is, what do you do at that point? I mean, you're a lawyer, right? And so do you find someone and you start building this? And the other side to that same question is, the customers for this, like you said, are the more complicated, the bigger the better kind of thing. I mean, the small SMB doesn't really have this problem. It's more like the legal firms and the bigger corps. So where do you go from here to just get started on solving this?
Yeah, so what I did was, and I do think this is one of the decisions that, like one of the best decisions we made, was I realized that this is not a problem. Like the management of this data is not something that lawyers or attorneys deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's what paralegals do. I wasn't a paralegal. I was a corporate lawyer at the time. And so the first thing I did was I started to talk to tons and tons of paralegals.
Sorry, let's dive into that because I think that's a little important. How did you do that? Like, how many paralegals are we talking about? And did you just cold email a bunch, or was it kind of
I cold
network?
emailed.
How did you structure
Yeah,
that?
so I cold emailed. We did like city tours. So we went to Toronto, we went to Vancouver, we went to Chicago, and we literally emailed as many paralegals as we could. And when we got a law firm, we got one of them to give us their boardroom, and we literally sat down with them for 3 hours and we had 10 or 15 paralegals in a room and just listening, just talk and just try.
Oh, wow. So it's like a focus group.
Yeah, totally. Just focus groups, right? And I mean, a lot of those people ended up becoming our first customers. That created a lot of commercial momentum for us. All those 10 people went and talked to 5 friends that are also paralegals and said, listen, I think these guys are going to try to solve this problem. We met with them, et cetera, et cetera. And you just started to build that commercial momentum around, we are a team we don't have a solution today, but we are trying to solve this problem. And you start to capture some of that attention.
On those focus groups, how did you structure it? Was it very open-ended? Hey, what are your problems, high level, or was it already kind of centered on this? This is a problem. How do you solve it today? And kind of a little bit more leading.
We had a series of meetings, and then we would meet with people one-on-one. And so we got in those formats, it's hard to get like really deep into the details. You're trying to get variety. I mean, really the outcome we were looking for is like, can we get 10 people to align on the problem and how to describe the problem? And like that'll chew up, 2 hours really quickly. And then, and then everybody's tired of the meeting. And then what we did to get in the details is we found, like through that process, we found some early, like very, very, very early customers that we called co-development partners. And so these were some larger law firms. Some of them are customers today, some of them are not, and they really wanted to solve the problem. And what a lot of them did was they really unlocked a ton of resources for us. So they gave us paralegals that, and this is a little bit sort of technical in how law firms or professional services firms work, but these people have to bill hours. And so they have to account for the hours in their day. Anybody that sort of understands this world will realize sort of how sort of important what this was for us. The firms gave some of these paralegals matter numbers to bill their time to. So it was like a matter number you'd assign to a client. And so we literally sat down and deconstructed like the existing legacy tools they were using screen by screen by screen. And, we probably sat down with paralegals that were, billing their time into this project for, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 months. And they would walk us through their legacy software. We would screenshot every page and like they would narrate to us what they are doing, in each of these screens and giving us the business context and sort of jobs to be done framework and stuff like that. And so we really methodically essentially tore down status quo to really understand. And that was super key for us to understand the scope of what we needed to build, because what we were going up against was, it's about the market's like 50-50 brownfield and spreadsheets, where, brownfield is legacy, really old legacy stuff that you have to rip and replace, out of the market. And so it was important that we understood, how the work was done. And there's a lot of wisdom built in legacy systems. People dismiss them as old and clunky. At the time, they weren't. And at the time, someone went through a product process over years and years and years to build something. And there's tons of wisdom in those legacy systems. And so we tried to extract as much wisdom as we could out of both the system and also how the users were using it.
I think there's also tons of wisdom in just the amount of time you devoted what you'd call customer discovery or problem validation. And you were already a lawyer, so I get you weren't paralegal, but you were close enough to it that a lot of people might have, in your shoes, just started building and kind of made a few assumptions, maybe spoke to 5 or 6 paralegals and showed them product demos and gone from there. You went really deep. How important was that, you think, to the ultimate success that your company has experienced?
Critical. I mean, when we have some competitors today that had a very similar origin story to me, where corporate lawyers observe the problem. They miss that step of okay, we got to sit down and spend 6 months with the primary users of this product and tear down their day-to-day at like a screen by screen, button by button level, and understand the story and the business context behind every action they take, so we can get the full scope and prioritize of how we build this. So we have competitors that miss that step, and they built it with the bias of how they look at the problem. And you have this huge disconnect. This product's being built from the perspective of a lawyer, but you got paralegals have to use it. Creates enormous disconnect, and then you obviously struggle from there, right? And so it was super critical for us. It allowed us to get just running the process and showing those early customers the work we put in. Like, that was my sales pitch. I literally brought up those Visio charts, was just like kind of like a Miro board type of thing, and like that was my sales pitch for the first year. Is I sat down with prospects in a boardroom, and this is obviously pre-COVID. You're pounding pavement, and I put that up on a Miro board or Visio at the time, and I pitched to them. I understand this problem. This is the work I've put in, and that immediately establishes credibility with these users and with these buyers that you understand what you're talking about. And when you're super early stage, like you signal no credibility at all. Right? Like you're a couple people, at the time we didn't even have an office, and you're trying to sell to these bigger organizations, and you have to establish credibility. And so that was one of the ways that we did that. And it was really effective.
And did you, just because, you started these focus groups, you went out to these paralegals to learn, it ended up getting you customers who pay these paralegals to help you build the product. Did you set out to get those co-development partners, or was that a little basically organic and it just kind of started coming to you as you went through this process?
Yeah, I mean, it started coming to us. I think probably what happened was when we realized the scope of this, we knew in order to get funding, we needed to get some commitment from these customers, like cash commitments. And so our first iteration of our first customers, they were contracts with deposits, but the balance was due on delivery of the product, which is when you're selling into mid-market enterprise, that's super high risk, because the definition, like they can just extend delivery until they get every single button they want, which obviously creates a lot of risk for you.
The way I think about it is, if you co-develop, the upside is you get a lot of information and a lot of feedback. I think the downside is you risk turning your customers into product managers, right? And there's a reason they're not building software. So how did you balance that, and what were some of the issues that came up?
It was super hard. And we had customers that had unreal expectations. We had customers, they wanted us to commit more than they were prepared to commit, in terms of, they wanted us to build all this stuff, but they didn't want to put down another 50 grand or 100 grand. And investors don't want to fund that. And so you're constantly trying to you're kind of caught between three tension points, right? Of customer, team, and investors, because you're also running your team really hard during this period of time, right? Because there's tons of pressure, there's tight timelines, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, the customers end up wanting to become product managers, and we had to fire a bunch of those customers. We had to walk away from the relationships, and we said, listen, this doesn't make sense. You're asking us to build stuff that we don't think the broader market wants. This is too specific to you, and even at an early stage, you're trying to learn from them, but you're also trying to teach them at the same time. And sometimes, we were lucky to find two customers where we could effectively create that cycle. And I think it was also just risk tolerance in the customer, right? Like the one thing that I realized is like, if you want to do this co-development process with mid-market or enterprise, you have to find people in those organizations that are willing to take a lot of risk. And I didn't realize this until I think a couple years later, but these people, director of paralegal was typically their title. They were putting their necks on the line. They were prepared to get fired if this didn't work out, because that's how big organizations work, right? You have a failed IT project. We spent a bunch of money. A couple people quit because they got burnt out. You get fired, right? And like I didn't appreciate until a couple years later how much risk that they were taking at the time, and I do now. But yeah, I mean, this is the stuff. I mean, we were very fortunate. We had four, and two we cut paths with, and the other two we kept working with. So, I do think that you do need to have multiple, and it's more work because you have more projects you're trying to manage, but it helps you manage the risk.
That makes total sense. So these are all, large customers that you're working with. You've got four of them on the go. Back then, were you bootstrapped or had you already raised some money?
So we raised a couple $100,000 on kind of like day one, just from, I think it was like $165,000, which in like 2017, actually bought something. And we used that to kind of fund, I would say the first, it was a small group of us. We used that to kind of fund sort of, really early kind of market analysis, like really early conversations, things like that. And then we had some evidence that, okay, we think there's a market here, and we raised $500,000. And then we started the co-development stuff. And then when it got time to actually, okay, we have a product, these contracts are starting to produce some cash, like customers are starting to pay deposit invoices, et cetera, et cetera. Then we raised the $2 million seed. Timing that was it's really like threading a needle. I remember on our $500,000 seed, I guess that would have been a pre-seed. I raised that on the strength of a large logo co-development partner, who then the relationship literally dissolved 30 days after we had closed that $500,000. So I had $500,000 of investors that had invested on the strength of this logo co-development, and it literally fell apart 30 days later. And then,
was that tough to manage afterwards? Like, was there some outcry or not really?
Well, I mean, you just need to figure it out, right? So I just went and I just found an equivalent amount of revenue opportunity, and I backfilled, and you just have to figure it out. And so, yeah. And so, timing the capital to the co-development milestones, to the customer commitments, et cetera, was super important, obviously, because you're burning an incredible amount of money to do this.
And what were the conversations like? Because at some point you have these co-development partners, but you have this deposit structure. It's not ideal. And you decide, these people really have to pay if they want to be customers. And that's where if I understand correctly, two of them churned. Like, what were those conversations like? Can you give us some of the details?
Yeah. I mean, the conversations at the time were very, I don't know how to put this. They were not very sophisticated conversations. We essentially said to them, you got to pay a deposit because we don't have any money, type of it was very unsophisticated at the time. I think if I would do this again, I think what I would say is something along the lines of, we're both taking risk here, and and we need cash commitment from you in order to justify us to take the risk of our time, to invest in this area, and I have kind of like my threshold, if I ever do this again, would be, I would not start cutting a line of code unless I can get, 6-figure order form deposits on the basis of a PowerPoint deck. If I'm unable to do that, I either have not identified a painful enough of a problem for the customer, or I have not articulated a compelling enough solution to that problem. Because the minute you start this process and you start, learning and building spec and writing code, you're opening the biggest can of worms of your life, and it just kind of spirals into, 5-6 years later, here you are. And so you really need to extract that commitment from the customer. And that's really your evidence that this is a serious enough problem.
I mean, especially, and I think founders often forget this, the larger customers spend a lot of money. Like that's the simplest way to put it. They spend a lot of money on stuff. And so I'm not going to go and say 100K is a drop in the bucket. It's not. But at the same time, you're not the only thing they're spending 100K on. And so if they're spending 100K over here and over there and over there, but on you, they won't, and they won't even spend 5K or 10K, something's wrong. You know, it's not like the next feature is going to get them over the night.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, if you're talking to like a medium-sized business, which let's say medium-sized businesses, I don't know, over 250 employees, for them to spend $25,000 on a deposit, is not a lot of money. If it's over 1,000 employees, call it sort of a mid-market organization, $100,000. If it's a real big enterprise, like I'd be looking for, mid six-figure commitments from them. And the reason is, and I think this is what you don't understand as a first-time founder, is that like the requirements to get your product into that organization and get cash flowing off of a contract, like you have adoption, you have cash, you have payments on your invoices and so on, you have that cash flow cycle starting. It's very uncertain because the total requirements of the organization is like an iceberg, right? What they tell you is probably, 30% at most of what you need to actually build to get that cash flowing. And that 60 to 70% is that unspoken requirement of, assumptions. They just assume it's going to have it. They're not technologists. They don't, they're not thinking about, SSO or permissions, like all these things they take for granted, but cost millions of dollars to build in real life. And then there's all these people that are going to pop out of the woodwork from IT or legal or other business units, and they require back-end infrastructure and security certifications and all these things. And so what you're being told is that like of what you need to build is at most 30% of total requirements, right? And so this is the risk where, as a capital allocator, which is fundamentally a founder's job, you have to think about the risk of that, and you have to think about what amount of commitment the customer is making to you to go through that process.
That's a really good analogy, the iceberg one, and it makes a lot of sense. And partly is what you said, and partly is also that they're potentially not used to buying from startups, and so other vendors that they buy from, do have all that stuff, and it's really about the 20%. So there's a lot of reasons for it. So you raise these $2 million, you have these two larger enterprise customers. Why do you decide to go a little bit down market into the mid market?
Yeah, I think it was really driven by two decisions. One was just efficiency, just go to market efficiency. The reality of these like very long sales cycles, really hit us, and we were commanding $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 annual contract values, but on a realistically 18 to 36 month sales cycle. If you're being realistic about enterprise, like look at the benchmarks, it says 12 to 18 months. That's best case scenario, right? Like it's really 3 years, depending where it's like, 18 months to 3 years. As an early stage startup, that just seemed very difficult for us. And we didn't think we had the track record to raise the required amount of capital to be able to fund that. And so we pivoted into mid-market where we were just seeing deals closing faster. The deals, a big one was there weren't as many product requirements on the contracts. So enterprise, yeah, we'll buy, but here's an addendum to the contract with like 15 pages of stuff you have to build. And so it was more efficient from an acquisition perspective. And so what we did is we just started targeting mid-market. And really the one thing there when you're targeting mid-market, and we define kind of mid-market as anywhere between 25 million of revenue up to 3 billion of revenue. I mean, everybody has their own definition, and people look at different, some people look at FTE headcount, or, we look at that revenue and a couple other factors. And so we do go a little bit high on mid-market with from a revenue threshold. But, really what we learned is, it's a volume game. You have to shift into thinking about volume. So your pipeline, like you're going to start needing hundreds of opportunities, to push through. And the other thing we learned is that, Canada doesn't have a very big mid-market, but the United States does. And I think that's one thing that does create some inefficiency in Canadian founders is in their home market, there's not a great mid-market. When you go to cities in the US like Cleveland or Indianapolis, there's just an ocean of companies, with a couple hundred employees making, 50 to $500 million a year of revenue.
So did you start selling into the US kind of right away, right off the bat?
No, our initial customers were all large Canadian law firms, and then our mid-market customers were increasingly US. We got some mid-market Canadian customers, and we thought, this is great. It's so much faster. There's just way less hair on these deals. We can make them happy within like a matter of weeks, not in a matter of like months or years type of timeline. And then just as we kind of navigated through the market, we just realized there was just a way bigger mid-market in the US. And so we just started pointing ourselves in that direction.
And looking at those first, let's say 10 or so customers, mid-market customers, which sounds like were mainly Canadian, how did you get those? Was that like you started an outbound process? Was it you calling these customers at first? Did you have a salesperson right away? How did you land those first 10, 15 customers?
Yeah, so they just started inbounding. It was a lot of inbound. It was a lot of referral. I mean, one of the beautiful things about law firms is, like a law firm or an accounting firm is really like a hub, kind of like a hub and spoke type of thing, where they're interacting with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of other organizations that, likely have a problem similar to the solution that you have. And so there's just tons of referral coming from these law firms. And so that was really the initial, kind of the initial wave of sort of inbound that we had. But it was organic, paid, and referral inbound would be a lot of it, like getting to the first sort of like million of ARR.
And now, a few years later, more or less, how many mid-market customers are you serving?
We have about 200 customers right now. I would say probably like 75% of them I would describe as mid-market. So we still do enterprise customers. They just have to fit inside of our, mid-market commercial motion and product framework and stuff like that. So we very, very, very rarely make product commitments on contracts and stuff like that, unless it's something that's already on the roadmap and maybe we're bringing it forward by 6 months. We were going to do it in Q4. We'll do it in Q2 if that's what's going to get this deal across the line. But we won't do, these sort of enormous, kind of addendums like we had to do in the early stages.
Makes sense. Perfect. Well, here's the last question that we always like to end on, which is, when did you know that you had product market fit?
When I saw our customers, well, I think there was 2 moments. So the first was when we closed our first, it was a $50,000 deal. It was like a mid-market law firm in Saskatchewan, and they're still one of their fantastic customers, and they're still one of my favorite customers. When we closed the deal and no founders were involved at all, right? Like that was kind of, okay, the product is speaking for itself. Somebody we've hired and have given being realistic, like minimal amounts of training, was able to sit down with the customer and say, here's the widget, do you want to buy? And they bought, right? And so, I think that was a big milestone. And then the next one for me is when I saw a customer post a job description for a paralegal, and on it had experience with Athennian, strongly preferred, or strong asset, some type of language like that. And for me, I saw that and I said, wow, like the customer must have a lot of commitment to this product to be including it in the job requirements, and they must expect that the rest of the market is purchasing this product at sufficient volume that there'd be talent in the market with experience using the product, right? And so, I think those 2 things were kind of the 2 big signals to me that we had, product market fit.
Okay, well, we'll stop it there. Just as a quick recap, you started off as a lawyer, you identified a problem, you went super deep in the validation and the customer discovery phase, which is something that I keep hearing about in these successful stories is a phase that founders that are successful tend not to skip. And so you spent 4 or 5 months talking to paralegals, doing focus groups, did some co-development with some large enterprises, and ultimately, shifted to mid-market and have grown ever since. Thanks a lot for sharing your story, Adrian. It's one that I think founders will learn a lot from.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pablo.
Thank you so much for listening all the way through. It's been a pleasure having you here. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.